What if one photograph was enough to make millions of people believe that Ibrahim Traore had betrayed Pan-Africanism? One handshake, one image, one frozen moment inside a formal diplomatic ceremony, and suddenly, across social media, the accusation began to spread. Burkina Faso has turned its back on its principles. Captain Ibrahim Traore has opened the door to Israel. The Pan-African dream has been compromised. But before we accept that conclusion, we must slow down. Because in politics, especially African politics, the most dangerous lies are not always invented from nothing. Sometimes they are built from something real, a real photo, a real handshake, a real ambassador. Then the background is removed, the wider ceremony is ignored, and the public is pushed toward a conclusion before they have time to ask one simple question. What actually happened that day? This story is not only about Israel. It is not only about Burkina Faso. It is about how a single image can be used as a weapon in the modern information war. It is about how leaders who challenge old power structures are watched, tested, and sometimes attacked through perception before they are attacked through policy. On that day, Ibrahim Traore did not receive only one ambassador. He received several ambassadors in a standard diplomatic ceremony. Yet, the image selected for outrage was the one that could create the biggest emotional reaction. That is not an accident. That is how narratives are built. So tonight, we are going to separate ceremony from strategy, diplomacy from alliance, and facts from emotional manipulation. We will examine why a diplomatic handshake does not automatically mean political surrender. We will look at why Burkina Faso continues to stand at the center of Africa, new debates about sovereignty, foreign pressure, and the future of the AES, and we will ask why Captain Ibrahim Traore has become such a powerful symbol that even one cropped image can ignite a continental argument. Don't forget to share your thoughts and let us know where you're from. Every comment you leave helps amplify Africa's voice across the globe. Because if we want to defend the truth, we cannot react only to images. We must understand the story behind them. When the photograph first appeared online, it seemed to confirm exactly what many people had been waiting to see. The image showed Captain Ibrahim Traore warmly shaking hands with Israel's newly accredited ambassador. Within hours, headlines, social media posts, and online commentators were asking the same provocative question. Had Burkina Faso quietly abandoned the principles that had made Ibrahim Traore one of the strongest symbols of modern Pan-Africanism? For many viewers, the photograph appeared convincing enough. After all, a picture often carries more emotional weight than an official government statement. A handshake between two officials can easily be interpreted as political approval, especially when the image is shared without any additional explanation. Yet, this is precisely where the controversy begins, because the photograph itself tells only a tiny fraction of the entire story. To understand what really happened, we must return to the official ceremony that took place in Ouagadougou. On that day, President Ibrahim Traore did not organize a special diplomatic meeting exclusively for Israel. Instead, Burkina Faso held a formal credential presentation ceremony, a long-established diplomatic tradition observed by countries across the world. During this ceremony, several newly appointed ambassadors presented their letters of credence to the president before officially beginning their diplomatic missions. Israel's ambassador was only one participant among multiple foreign representatives who attended the same event. Ambassadors from several other countries also presented their credentials during the ceremony, each receiving the same protocol, the same official welcome, and the same ceremonial handshake. However, once the event reached social media, almost every other photograph disappeared from public discussion. Instead, only one image continued to circulate. The handshake with Israel became isolated from the rest of the ceremony, creating the impression that an extraordinary diplomatic breakthrough had taken place. This illustrates one of the oldest techniques in modern information campaigns. The facts themselves are not always fabricated. Instead, only a carefully selected portion of reality is presented. By removing surrounding context, an ordinary diplomatic event can suddenly appear to represent a dramatic political transformation. The emotional impact was immediate. Supporters of Ibrahim Traore questioned whether he had compromised his principles. Critics declared that Burkina Faso had exposed its own contradictions. Others suggested that the country was quietly moving away from its anti-colonial position. Yet none of these conclusions could actually be drawn from the photograph alone. A camera captures only a fraction of a second. It cannot explain diplomatic protocol. It cannot reveal government policy. It cannot describe the broader agenda of an international ceremony. Most importantly, it cannot replace official decisions made through state institutions. The viral image succeeded because it appealed to emotion before evidence. People naturally react to symbols. A handshake is a powerful visual symbol, but symbols only become meaningful when they are supported by facts. Without context, even an authentic photograph can produce an inaccurate understanding of reality. This is why examining the complete sequence of events matters far more than reacting to a single frame. Before asking whether Ibrahim Traore changed his political direction, we must first understand what the ceremony actually represented. Only then can we begin separating diplomatic protocol from strategic policy. Diplomatic ceremonies are designed to create order between nations, not headlines on social media. Unfortunately, in today's digital world, protocol is often mistaken for policy, and symbolism is frequently confused with strategy. That misunderstanding sits at the heart of the controversy surrounding Ibrahim Traore's handshake with Israel's ambassador. To understand why, we must first understand what actually happens when a new ambassador arrives in a foreign country. Under international diplomatic practice, every newly appointed ambassador must present official letters of credence to the head of state of the country where they have been assigned. These documents formally confirm that the ambassador represents their government and is authorized to conduct diplomatic affairs. Until this ceremony takes place, the ambassador cannot fully perform official duties. This process is followed in Washington, London, Paris, Tokyo, Beijing, Pretoria, and virtually every other capital in the world. Burkina Faso is no exception. The ceremony itself follows a carefully established protocol. The ambassador arrives with official credentials, is welcomed by the head of state, presents the documents, exchanges a formal handshake, and often poses briefly for photographs before meeting concludes. None of these steps automatically signal political alignment or ideological agreement. They simply acknowledge the existence of diplomatic relations between two sovereign states. This distinction becomes even more important in the case of Israel and Burkina Faso. Many people assumed the handshake meant a brand new diplomatic relationship had been established. In reality, diplomatic relations between the two countries have existed for many years. Israel does not even maintain a resident ambassador permanently stationed in Ouagadougou. Instead, its ambassador based in Côte d'Ivoire is simultaneously accredited to Burkina Faso, Benin, and Togo. This arrangement, known as non-resident accreditation, is common throughout Africa, where ambassadors frequently represent several neighboring countries at the same time. Therefore, when Ambassador Simon Clement Seroussi presented his credentials, he was not inaugurating an entirely new political partnership. He was completing the normal diplomatic process required whenever a new ambassador assumes responsibility for countries under his accreditation. This raises another important distinction that is often overlooked. Diplomatic recognition is not the same as political alliance. Countries maintain embassies and exchange ambassadors for many practical reasons. They protect citizens abroad. They facilitate trade. They negotiate humanitarian issues. They coordinate consular services. They communicate during crises. Diplomatic channels remain valuable even between governments that disagree strongly on regional conflicts, security issues, or ideological questions. History offers countless examples. Many countries maintain diplomatic relations despite openly criticizing one another's domestic policies or foreign actions. Diplomatic communication exists precisely because disagreements are easier to manage when dialogue remains possible. This is why interpreting a ceremonial handshake as proof of ideological transformation is a logical leap unsupported by diplomatic practice. A nation's strategic direction cannot be measured by one photograph. It must be measured through legislation, official policy, military cooperation, economic agreements, voting behavior in international organizations, and long-term diplomatic decisions. Viewed through that broader lens, the ceremony in Ouagadougou appears far less dramatic than social media initially suggested. It was not evidence of sudden political realignment. It was an example of routine statecraft operating according to international norms. Understanding that distinction allows us to ask a much more meaningful question. If the ceremony itself was ordinary, why did one ordinary diplomatic photograph generate such extraordinary global controversy? If the diplomatic ceremony itself followed international protocol, another question immediately emerges. Why did this particular photograph spread so quickly, while the images of the other ambassadors who presented their credentials on the very same day received almost no attention? The answer lies not only in diplomacy, but also in perception. Today, Ibrahim Traore is no longer viewed simply as the president of Burkina Faso. Over the past several years, he has become one of the most recognizable political figures on the African continent. Supporters see him as a symbol of national sovereignty, resource independence, and the growing determination of African nations to reduce external influence over their political and economic decisions. Whether one agrees with his policies or not, there is little doubt that his image now carries significance far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. This explains why almost every public appearance made by Ibrahim Traore attracts extraordinary international attention. A speech, a military parade, a meeting with foreign officials, or even a single photograph can quickly become the subject of thousands of online discussions. His image has become more than personal. It has become symbolic. That symbolism is closely connected to the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as the AES. Since Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger strengthened their cooperation, many observers have viewed the alliance as an attempt to redefine political and security cooperation in the Sahel. At the same time, the governments involved have repeatedly emphasized sovereignty, regional cooperation, and the reduction of dependency on traditional external partners. Against this background, every diplomatic decision made by Ibrahim Traore is examined through a much larger political lens. Some commentators immediately argued that receiving Israel's ambassador contradicted Pan-African ideals. Others claimed that Burkina Faso had quietly changed its foreign policy. However, these conclusions assume that maintaining diplomatic relations automatically means endorsing every policy of another state. International diplomacy rarely operates that way. Throughout modern history, governments have maintained diplomatic relations with countries whose domestic or foreign policies they openly criticize. Dialogue often continues precisely because disagreement exists. Diplomacy is not designed only for friends. It also exists to manage differences, prevent misunderstandings, protect national interests, and preserve communication during periods of political tension. This reflects an important aspect of Ibrahim Traore's own approach to international relations. His public statements have consistently emphasized that Burkina Faso seeks partnerships based on mutual respect rather than dependence. That principle does not necessarily require isolating the country from governments with different political positions. Instead, it suggests evaluating each relationship according to Burkina Faso's national interests while preserving decision-making independence. This distinction is often lost in online debates, where foreign policy is reduced to simple categories of allies and enemies. Reality is far more complex. A country may reject foreign interference while continuing diplomatic communication. It may defend its sovereignty while expanding its international partnerships. It may cooperate economically with one nation while disagreeing with that nation's policies in other areas. Understanding this complexity is essential before interpreting any single diplomatic event. Rather than asking whether one handshake changed everything, perhaps the more important question is this: has Burkina Faso's broader strategy actually changed? To answer that question honestly, we must move beyond photographs and examine the country's long-term policies, official statements, and actions. Only then can we distinguish genuine strategic change from assumptions created by carefully selected images circulating across social media. As the photograph continued spreading across social media, another battle began almost immediately. It was no longer a debate about diplomatic protocol. It became a battle over interpretation. Some Western commentators and critics argued that the image exposed what they described as a contradiction in Ibrahim Traore's political message. If Burkina Faso claimed to defend Pan-African sovereignty and oppose external domination, they asked, why would its president formally receive Israel's ambassador to them? The handshake represented a dramatic shift in foreign policy and suggested that the country's revolutionary image was beginning to soften. These arguments quickly gained attention because they appeared simple and emotionally persuasive. Yet, international politics is rarely simple. The first weakness in this criticism is the assumption that diplomatic recognition automatically equals political endorsement. That assumption ignores one of the most basic principles of international relations. Countries often maintain diplomatic relations with governments whose policies they openly criticize. Diplomatic communication exists precisely because disagreement is common, not because agreement is universal. A second criticism suggested that Burkina Faso had abandoned its commitment to Pan-Africanism. However, examining the country's broader actions presents a far more complicated picture. Since the creation of the Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso has continued strengthening military cooperation with Mali and Niger. The government has repeatedly emphasized regional security cooperation, economic sovereignty, and reducing dependence on former colonial structures. These long-term policies remain central to its public strategy. One ceremonial diplomatic event, by itself, does not outweigh years of official decisions and institutional reforms. Another criticism focused on symbolism. Some observers argued that symbolism matters as much as policy, because public perception influences political legitimacy. There is truth in that observation. Symbols do matter. Leaders understand the power of images, and governments carefully manage public appearances because photographs often travel faster than official documents. However, acknowledging the importance of symbolism does not mean allowing symbolism to replace evidence. A responsible analysis requires distinguishing between what an image shows and what it actually proves. The photograph proves that Ibrahim Traore received an ambassador according to diplomatic protocol. It does not prove that Burkina Faso changed its geopolitical orientation. It does not prove that Pan-Africanism has been abandoned. It does not prove the existence of a new strategic alliance. Those conclusions require additional evidence that extends far beyond a single ceremony. The controversy also illustrates how information competition increasingly shapes international politics. Today's geopolitical struggles are fought not only through economics, diplomacy, or military influence, but also through narratives. Competing interpretations race across digital platforms, each seeking to define public understanding before verified information reaches wider audiences. For African governments, this presents an increasingly difficult challenge. Every official appearance can become part of a broader international conversation shaped by supporters, critics, activists, journalists, and anonymous social media accounts operating across multiple countries. Context often disappears long before facts can catch up. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this controversy is that skepticism should apply equally to every side of the debate. Blind acceptance and automatic rejection are equally dangerous. Careful examination of evidence remains the strongest defense against misinformation. Rather than asking which narrative is louder, responsible observers should ask which interpretation is supported by the greatest amount of verifiable evidence. Only through that approach can complex international events be understood with fairness, balance, and intellectual honesty. Beyond the debate surrounding one photograph lies a much larger lesson, not only for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation seeking to strengthen its sovereignty in an era shaped by instant communication and global information competition. One of the first lessons is that diplomacy and public communication can no longer be treated as separate fields. In previous generations, diplomatic ceremonies were followed mainly by government officials and foreign policy experts. Today, every handshake, every photograph, and every public appearance can reach millions of people within minutes. In many cases, the image travels much faster than the official explanation. That reality places a new responsibility on governments. Foreign policy is no longer judged only by official documents or international agreements. It is increasingly judged by public perception. If governments fail to explain the context of important diplomatic events, others will often provide their own interpretations. Those interpretations may be accurate, incomplete, or deliberately misleading. For Burkina Faso, the controversy demonstrates the importance of proactive communication. Explaining why a diplomatic ceremony takes place, who participates, and what it actually means can prevent unnecessary confusion before speculation dominates public discussion. The second lesson concerns strategic independence. Maintaining sovereignty does not require diplomatic isolation. Throughout history, successful states have often maintained communication with governments whose policies they did not fully support. Dialogue creates opportunities for negotiation, protects national interests, and reduces the risk of misunderstanding during periods of international tension. Strategic independence is therefore measured not by the number of diplomatic handshakes a country avoids, but by its ability to make decisions according to its own national interests without external coercion. The third lesson involves the responsibility of citizens themselves. Modern information warfare depends heavily on speed. Emotional reactions spread faster than careful analysis. Images spread faster than official reports. Headlines spread faster than evidence. For that reason, every citizen now plays a role in protecting public understanding. Before accepting dramatic political claims, it is worth asking several simple questions. What happened before this photograph was taken? What happened afterward? What do official government statements say? Does one isolated event match the country's broader pattern of decisions over time? These questions encourage critical thinking rather than emotional reaction. Finally, this episode reminds us that leadership should be evaluated through consistency rather than isolated moments. A country's long-term direction becomes visible through years of policy decisions. Economic reforms, diplomatic initiatives, and security strategies. Individual ceremonies may attract attention, but they rarely define an entire national strategy on their own. For African nations navigating an increasingly competitive international environment, this may be one of the most valuable lessons of all. Protecting sovereignty requires not only political independence, but also the ability to communicate clearly, preserve context, and resist narratives built upon incomplete information. Only by combining strategic diplomacy with transparent communication can countries ensure that their policies are understood according to facts rather than assumptions. In today's world, defending national interests also means defending the truth behind the images that shape global opinion. As we reach the end of this story, we return to the same question that sparked such intense debate across social media. Did one photograph truly reveal that Burkina Faso had abandoned its principles, or did it reveal something very different about the way information now travels across the modern world? After examining the full sequence of events, the answer becomes much clearer. The photograph itself was authentic. The handshake genuinely happened. Israel's ambassador was officially received by Captain Ibrahim Traore during a formal diplomatic ceremony. None of these facts are in dispute. What became disputed was the meaning attached to that single moment. When the broader context is restored, we discover that the ceremony included multiple ambassadors presenting their credentials under established diplomatic protocol. We also find that diplomatic recognition does not automatically create political alliance, ideological agreement, or strategic realignment. Most importantly, we find no single piece of evidence demonstrating that Burkina Faso officially abandoned the principles that have shaped its recent foreign policy. This does not mean every question has been answered forever. Foreign policy evolves over time, and every government adjusts its priorities according to changing national interests. Responsible observers should continue evaluating Burkina Faso by watching its future decisions, official agreements, economic policies, regional partnerships, and diplomatic actions, rather than relying upon isolated moments captured by a camera. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson from the entire controversy. In today's digital age, information no longer competes only through accuracy. It competes through speed, emotion, and symbolism. A carefully selected photograph can travel around the world before a complete explanation is ever published. By the time facts arrive, millions of opinions may already have been formed. That reality places responsibility on all of us. As viewers, we should resist the temptation to draw immediate conclusions from dramatic images. As citizens, we should seek complete context before sharing claims that may influence public understanding. As students of international affairs, we should remember that diplomacy often operates quietly beneath headlines designed to generate outrage. The future of Pan-Africanism will not be determined by one photograph. The future of Burkina Faso will not be determined by one ceremonial handshake. The future of Captain Ibrahim Traore will ultimately be judged by the consistency of his government's long-term actions, the strength of national institutions, the welfare of the Burkinabe people, and the direction that the country chooses over many years rather than many minutes. Across the continent, discussions about sovereignty, development, security, and international partnerships will continue to shape the future of Africa anew, whether through the African Union, regional cooperation, or the broader vision of Pan-Africanism. African nations will continue searching for ways to protect their interests while engaging with an increasingly complex world. For many supporters, Captain Ibrahim Traore remains a symbol of determination. For critics, Ibrahim Traore remains a controversial political figure whose decisions deserve careful scrutiny. Both perspectives deserve to be examined through evidence rather than assumptions. What should never be forgotten is that every important international story deserves patience, context, and careful analysis before judgment. If you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe to the channel and join us again as we continue exploring the biggest political and historical developments shaping Pan-African thought. Burkina Faso and the future of Africa. For years, the world was told one story about Burkina Faso. They said the country was isolated. They said it was too dangerous to approach. They said Ouagadougou had become a place where serious diplomacy could no longer stand. But then, in one single morning, the cameras opened, the red carpet was laid out, and 8 nations walked through the front door. Not one country, not 2, 8. Their ambassadors came to present their letters of credence before Captain Ibrahim Traore, the leader so many Western voices have tried to describe as cut off from the world. And that one ceremony did something no press conference could have done. It placed a living picture in front of the planet and asked a simple question. If Burkina Faso is so isolated, why are nations from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia still sending ambassadors to Ouagadougou? And while this was happening in public, another story was unfolding in the background. France, after losing much of its old influence in the Sahel, is now accused of searching for new ways to remain close to the region through private companies, training programs, humanitarian networks, and softer tools of influence. So today, we are not just talking about one diplomatic ceremony. We are talking about a new chapter in Africa's struggle to define itself. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why this morning in Ouagadougou may have shaken more than one capital in Europe. And if you value this kind of honest African perspective, make sure you follow this channel and keep this conversation alive. Now let us look closely at what happened inside the diplomatic ceremony itself, because the details matters. At the Koulouba Palace in Ouagadougou, 8 ambassadors came forward to present their letters of credence to Captain Ibrahim Traore. In diplomatic language, this is not a casual visit. A letter of credence is the formal document that allows an ambassador to represent one's nation before the leader of another nation. That means these countries were not just sending greetings. They were opening or renewing official lines of communication with Burkina Faso at the highest diplomatic level. Among the countries involved were nations connected to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. This matters because it shows that Burkina Faso is not speaking to only one political camp. It is reaching across regions, across cultures, and across old alliances. And this is where the Western narrative begins to crack. For years, people were told that Burkina Faso was becoming untouchable, that no serious country would want to stand beside it, and that Ouagadougou was drifting into isolation. But isolation does not look like 8 ambassadors arriving in one morning. Isolation does not look like formal ceremonies, state protocol, flag, uniforms, and diplomatic recognition. Now, Todd, to be fair, this does not mean Burkina Faso has no security challenges. The country still faces real threats. The people still need peace, safety, and stability. But the ceremony proves something important. It proves that a country can face serious problems and still remain diplomatically alive. It proves that the story is more complex than the headlines suggest. And for Ibrahim Traore, that image was powerful. Without shouting, without arguing, and without begging for approval, Burkina Faso allowed the world to see that it still has partners willing to enter through the front door. Burkina Faso's diplomatic ceremony did not happen by accident. It was part of a much broader shift that has been taking shape since Captain Ibrahim Traore came to power in 2022. Rather than relying on a single international partner, His government has pursued a policy of expanding diplomatic options. Instead of looking almost exclusively toward former colonial relationships, Burkina Faso has steadily opened new channels with countries across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and other parts of the global South. This approach is based on a simple idea. A sovereign nation should have the freedom to choose its partners according to its own interests, not according to historical expectations or external pressure. That is why the presence of ambassadors from such diverse regions carries political weight. It suggests that Burkina Faso is trying to build relationships that extend beyond traditional alliances. Some of these partnerships are long established, while others are only beginning. Together, however, they reflect a foreign policy that seeks flexibility rather than dependence. This vision also fits within the broader Alliance of Sahel States, formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The alliance was created to strengthen regional cooperation on security, economic development, and political coordination after relations with several Western partners deteriorated, whether one agrees with every decision made by these governments or not. The alliance represents an effort to redefine regional priorities through local leadership. For Ibrahim Traore, diplomacy is also about changing perception. Military victories may influence events on the ground, but diplomatic recognition shapes how a nation is viewed abroad. Every ambassador received at the Koulouba Palace sent a message that Burkina Faso remains engaged with the international community. This does not erase the country's challenges, nor does it guarantee future success, but it demonstrates that many governments still see value in maintaining dialogue with Ouagadougou. In international politics, that alone is an important signal, because diplomacy is ultimately built on the willingness to keep communication alive, even during difficult times. While Burkina Faso was expanding its diplomatic outreach, another important story was unfolding beyond the cameras. France, which had once maintained a dominant military presence across much of the Sahel, was facing a very different reality. Over the past several years, French forces withdrew from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after growing political tensions and public opposition. Long-standing defense agreements were reconsidered, military bases were closed, and the regional balance that had existed for decades began to shift. Faced with these changes, many analysts argue that France has been exploring a different approach to maintaining its influence. Rather than relying primarily on visible military deployments, greater attention is now being placed on diplomatic partnerships, development assistance, security training, economic investment, cultural institutions, and cooperation with private organizations. Supporters of this strategy describe it as a more modern and cooperative model of international engagement. Critics, however, argue that these softer tools can also preserve political influence without the visibility of military bases. The debate remains active, and different observers reach different conclusions. What is clear is that influence in the 21st century is no longer measured only by the number of soldiers stationed abroad. It is increasingly measured by who trains local institutions, who finances infrastructure, who supports education, who invests in strategic industries, and who helps shape public narratives. For Burkina Faso, this changing landscape presents both opportunities and responsibilities. Expanding diplomatic choices gives the country more room to pursue its own priorities, but it also requires careful management to ensure that replacing one external dependency does not simply create another. The ceremony in Ouagadougou and the broader debate surrounding France's evolving strategy illustrate a larger transformation taking place across the Sahel. Military competition is gradually giving way to a more complex contest built around diplomacy, economics, development, and influence. In this new environment, relationships may be less visible than military bases, but they are no less important in shaping the future of the region. As this story continues, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If diplomacy is shaping the future of Africa, then who controls the story that the world hears? For decades, international narratives about the Sahel have often focused on conflict, instability, military coups, and humanitarian crises. These are real issues, and they deserve attention. However, they are not the entire picture. The ceremony in Ouagadougou offered a different image. Instead of soldiers, the cameras captured diplomats. Instead of military convoys, they showed ambassadors carrying official documents. It was a reminder that diplomacy can sometimes challenge perceptions more effectively than political speeches. Captain Ibrahim Traore has clearly understood the importance of that symbolism. Whether speaking to domestic audiences or international partners, his government has tried to present Burkina Faso as a country determined to make its own choices. For many supporters across Africa, this represents a broader message about sovereignty, dignity, and the right to pursue independent foreign policies. At the same time, it is important to recognize that critics continue to raise serious concerns about governance, democratic transition, freedom of the press, and human rights inside Burkina Faso. These concerns remain part of the international discussion and should not be ignored. The reality, therefore, is more balanced than either extreme. Burkina Faso is neither the completely isolated state described by some critics, nor a country without significant internal challenges. Both realities exist simultaneously. Perhaps that is the biggest lesson from this entire episode. Modern geopolitics is no longer fought only with weapons or military alliances. It is also fought through information, public perception, diplomatic visibility, and the ability to shape international opinion. In today's world, controlling the narrative has become almost as valuable as controlling territory. And by hosting 8 ambassadors in one carefully watched ceremony, Burkina Faso demonstrated that sometimes a single diplomatic image can reshape a conversation that has lasted for years. The events in Ouagadougou also offer valuable lessons for other African nations navigating an increasingly competitive international environment. The first lesson is that sovereignty is strongest when it is supported by diplomatic diversity. No country benefits from depending entirely on a single foreign partner. By maintaining relationships with multiple regions of the world, governments gain greater flexibility to pursue policies that reflect their own national interests. The second lesson is that natural resources alone do not create independence. Gold, uranium, strategic minerals, and agricultural wealth can strengthen a nation only if they are managed through transparent institutions, responsible leadership, and long-term planning. Without effective governance, valuable resources can easily become sources of competition rather than prosperity. A third lesson concerns strategic communication. Every nation has the right to tell its own story. If governments fail to explain their policies and achievements, others will often shape international opinion on their behalf. Public diplomacy, credible institutions, and consistent communication have become essential parts of modern statecraft. There is also an important warning. Replacing one external influence with another does not automatically create genuine independence, whether partnerships involve Western countries, emerging powers, or regional allies. Every agreement should ultimately be measured by one standard. Does it improve the lives of ordinary citizens? For Burkina Faso, the path ahead remains challenging. Security concerns, economic development, and national reconciliation will continue to test the country's leadership. Diplomatic recognition alone cannot solve these issues. Lasting success will depend on stability, accountable institutions, and opportunities for future generations. Even so, the ceremony that brought 8 ambassadors to Ouagadougou demonstrated one undeniable reality. Burkina Faso is determined to participate actively in shaping its own future, whether the world agrees with every policy or not. The country has shown that it intends to make its choices through engagement rather than isolation, and through dialogue rather than silence. As we reach the end of this discussion, it becomes clear that the story of Burkina Faso is no longer as simple as many headlines have suggested. The ceremony at the Koulouba Palace did not erase the country's security challenges. It did not solve every political disagreement, nor did it remove the economic difficulties that many Burkinabe families continue to face. Those realities remain, and they deserve honest attention. Yet another reality also deserves recognition. When 8 ambassadors arrived to formally present their credentials before Captain Ibrahim Traore, they send a message that extends far beyond one ceremonial event. They demonstrate that Burkina Faso continues to participate in international diplomacy, continues to build partnerships, and continues to make choices about its own future. At the same time, France and other international actors are reassessing their place in a rapidly changing Sahel. Influence today is no longer defined only by military bases or security agreements. It is increasingly shaped by diplomacy, investment, education, development, and the ability to build lasting partnerships. Ultimately, the future of Africa will not be determined solely by outside powers. It will depend on the decisions made by African leaders, African institutions, and African citizens themselves. The countries that succeed will be those that protect their sovereignty while remaining open to balanced cooperation with the wider world. So, what do you think? Did the arrival of 8 ambassadors genuinely challenge the narrative that Burkina Faso is isolated? Is Africa entering a new diplomatic era where partnerships matter more than old alliances? And how should African nations balance sovereignty with international cooperation in an increasingly competitive world? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective is an important part of this conversation. If you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe and join us for more discussions on Pan-African affairs, Burkina Faso, Africa New, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, and the future vision of Ibrahim Traore. Until next time, thank you for watching, and take care. Just hours after the European Parliament adopted a resolution criticizing Burkina Faso, the government of Captain Ibrahim Traore responded with a move that immediately captured attention across Africa and beyond. Instead of issuing a routine diplomatic statement, Burkina Faso summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a direct message. The country expressed its disappointment, its disapproval, and what officials described as profound disgust toward a resolution they believe was built on misinformation and outdated assumptions. At the center of the controversy lies a simple but powerful question. Who gave the European Parliament the authority to judge a sovereign nation that is not even a member of the European Union? According to the resolution, Burkina Faso faces worsening security conditions, shrinking civic freedoms, and growing humanitarian challenges. European lawmakers argued that large portions of the country's territory remain outside government control and warned that instability in the Sahel could threaten the wider West African region. For many observers in Brussels, this was presented as a concern for democracy, human rights, and regional security. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Officials argued that the resolution ignored the sacrifices made by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in their ongoing struggle against terrorism. They insisted that the document relied on inaccurate information and reflected a mindset that many Africans increasingly reject. What began as a parliamentary resolution quickly evolved into something much larger. It became a debate about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of nations to determine their own future. And as tensions rose, one thing became clear. This was no longer simply about security or human rights. It was about who gets to define reality for Africa in the 21st century. The response from Burkina Faso was not delayed, cautious, or diplomatic in the traditional sense. Within hours of the European Parliament's resolution, the government summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a message that left little room for ambiguity. Officials in Ouagadougou argued that the resolution was based on inaccurate information and failed to reflect the reality on the ground. More importantly, they viewed it as an unacceptable intrusion into the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. During the meeting, Burkina Faso's foreign minister made a point that would become the centerpiece of the country's response. Burkina Faso is not a member of the European Union. Therefore, the European Parliament has neither the authority nor the legitimacy to position itself as a judge over Burkina Faso's domestic policies, security decisions, or management of civic space. The government also challenged the credibility of some of the claims presented before European lawmakers. According to officials, the parliamentarian who introduced the criticism relied on figures and assessments that did not accurately represent the situation in the country. They questioned how such sweeping conclusions could be made about a nation that many of its critics had never personally visited. But the strongest language was reserved for what Burkina Faso described as a lingering neo-colonial attitude. Officials argued that the resolution reflected an outdated belief that African nations must constantly justify themselves before Western institutions. In their view, this approach ignores both national sovereignty and the sacrifices being made by countries fighting terrorism under extremely difficult conditions. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would not accept external actors defining its political reality or dictating its internal choices, whether one agrees with the government's position or not. The response marked a significant moment in the country's foreign policy. It signaled that under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso intends to confront criticism directly and defend its decisions on the international stage without seeking approval from foreign powers. One of the most controversial aspects of Burkina Faso's response was its decision to bring NATO and Libya back into the conversation. For officials in Ouagadougou, the current security crisis in the Sahel cannot be discussed honestly without examining the events that unfolded more than a decade ago. In 2011, a NATO-led military intervention contributed to the collapse of Libya's government under Muammar Gaddafi. While supporters of the intervention argued that it was necessary to protect civilians, critics have long maintained that the operation created consequences that spread far beyond Libya's borders. According to this view, the fall of the Libyan state triggered the movement of weapons, armed groups, and experienced fighters across vast areas of North and West Africa. The fragile security environment that followed created opportunities for extremist organizations to expand their influence throughout the Sahel region. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this historical context matters. Their leaders argue that today's insecurity did not emerge in isolation. Instead, it developed through a chain of events that involved decisions made by powerful international actors years earlier. This is why Burkina Faso reacted strongly when European lawmakers criticized the country's security situation without acknowledging what officials describe as the deeper roots of the crisis. From their perspective, it is unfair to discuss the consequences while ignoring the causes. Supporters of this argument believe that Western governments should recognize their share of responsibility for the instability that followed the collapse of Libya. Critics, however, counter that, regardless of past mistakes, current governments must still be judged by their ability to protect citizens and restore stability. The debate remains highly contested, but it has become a powerful political tool across the Sahel. By linking today's security challenges to earlier international interventions, Burkina Faso shifts the conversation away from immediate criticism and toward a broader discussion about accountability. As a result, the dispute with the European Parliament is no longer just about terrorism or governance. It has evolved into a debate over history itself, and over who bears responsibility for one of Africa's most persistent security crises. While the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may appear to be a diplomatic disagreement, many observers believe a larger transformation is taking place across the Sahel. At the center of that transformation stands the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as AES, bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What makes this alliance different is that it was not created merely as a security arrangement. It represents a political statement. The three governments have repeatedly declared that they intend to reduce external influence over their domestic and regional affairs while strengthening cooperation among themselves. For decades, regional security strategies in West Africa relied heavily on support from foreign partners, particularly France and other Western countries. However, after years of continuing instability and growing frustration among local populations, leaders in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began pursuing a different path. The creation of AES signaled that shift. The alliance seeks to coordinate military operations, improve border security, and develop common approaches to economic and political challenges. Supporters see it as an effort to create African solutions for African problems. The alliance has also taken symbolic steps that demonstrate its long-term ambitions. These include discussions on common institutions, increased economic coordination, and policies designed to strengthen regional integration outside traditional frameworks. Such moves suggest that AES is not intended to be a temporary response to a crisis, but rather a new geopolitical project. For European policymakers, this development creates new uncertainties. A region that was once strongly influenced by Western partners is increasingly making decisions independently. For the governments involved, however, that independence is precisely the objective. This broader context helps explain why criticism from the European Parliament triggered such a strong reaction in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso did not view the resolution as an isolated statement. Instead, many officials saw it as part of a larger struggle over who will shape the future of the Sahel. Whether AES ultimately succeeds or fails remains uncertain. What is certain is that it has already changed the political conversation across West Africa and beyond. Beneath the diplomatic language and political arguments lies another issue that many analysts believe is impossible to ignore: resources. The Sahel is not only a region facing security challenges, it is also home to some of Africa's most valuable strategic minerals, resources that have become increasingly important in a rapidly changing global economy. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's major gold producers. Neighboring Niger possesses significant uranium reserves that have long contributed to international energy markets. Mali is emerging as an important player in the lithium sector, a resource essential for batteries, electric vehicles, and future technologies. For supporters of Ibrahim Traore and the broader Alliance of Sahel States, these resources are at the heart of the current struggle. They argue that for decades, African nations exported immense wealth while receiving limited benefits in return. As a result, many citizens continue to ask a difficult question: how can countries rich in natural resources remain among the poorest in the world? Traore has built much of his political message around that concern. He frequently emphasizes that national resources should first serve national development. According to this vision, gold, minerals, and other strategic assets must contribute directly to infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for local populations. This message has helped transform Ibrahim Traore into more than a national leader. Across parts of Africa, He has become a symbol of a new generation of leadership focused on sovereignty, self-reliance, tweeters, and economic independence. His speeches are widely shared on social media, and his image increasingly resonates far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Supporters view him as a leader willing to challenge long-standing power structures. Critics argue that symbolism alone is not enough, and that lasting success must be measured through tangible improvements in security and living standards. Regardless of where one stands, Traore's growing influence helps explain why developments in Burkina Faso attract so much international attention. The debate is no longer only about one government or one country. It has become a discussion about who controls Africa's resources and who ultimately benefits from them. At its core, the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament reflects a much larger debate that extends far beyond West Africa. It is a debate between two competing visions of governance, legitimacy, and international responsibility. From the perspective of many European policymakers, raising concerns about human rights, democratic standards, and security conditions is both necessary and justified. They argue that governments should be held accountable when freedoms are restricted, humanitarian crises deepen, or instability threatens neighboring countries. In this view, international scrutiny is not interference, but part of a broader commitment to universal values. Burkina Faso sees the issue differently. Officials in Ouagadougou argue that no external institution has the right to dictate how a sovereign nation should manage its internal affairs. They maintain that security challenges, political transitions, and development priorities must be addressed according to national realities rather than foreign expectations. For them, sovereignty is not a symbolic concept. It is the foundation of independence. This difference in perspective explains why the reaction to the European resolution was so strong. The government was not merely responding to criticism, it was defending what it considers a fundamental principle, the right of a nation to choose its own path. The question, therefore, becomes larger than Burkina Faso itself. It touches on an issue increasingly debated across Africa, Asia, and other parts of the developing world. Should international institutions play a greater role in shaping domestic policies, or should nations retain the final authority over their own future, regardless of outside opinion? There is no simple answer. Yet the growing intensity of this debate suggests that the global balance between sovereignty and international influence is being redefined before our eyes. The confrontation between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may have started with a single resolution, but it has revealed a much deeper struggle over sovereignty, influence, and the future direction of Africa. For Burkina Faso, the issue is not simply about responding to criticism. It is about defending the principle that every nation has the right to determine its own political, security, and economic path. For the European Union, the debate remains tied to concerns about human rights, democratic governance, and regional stability. Between these two positions lies one of the defining geopolitical discussions of our time: the emergence of the Alliance of Sahel States, the growing emphasis on resource sovereignty, and the rise of leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traore suggest that a new chapter is unfolding across the continent. Whether these changes ultimately succeed will depend not on rhetoric alone, but on the ability to deliver security, development, and opportunity to ordinary citizens. Perhaps the most important lesson for Africa is that sovereignty must be matched by responsibility, unity, and long-term vision. What do you think? Should international institutions have the authority to publicly judge the internal affairs of sovereign nations? Or should those decisions belong exclusively to the people of each country? If you enjoy discussions about Pan-Africanism, Burkina Faso, Africa New, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, and the future of Pan-Africanism, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next analysis.
476 votes in favor, only 11 votes against. At first glance, that looks like the end of the story. A European Parliament almost united. A resolution passed, and Burkina Faso placed once again under the judgment of outside powers. But sometimes history does not move through the loudest majority. Sometimes it moves through the small voice that refuses to disappear. That is why Mark Botenga's vote matters. He was not standing in a comfortable position. He was not following the crowd. He stood among a tiny minority and asked a question that many in Europe did not want to hear. If Europe speaks of partnership with Africa, why does that partnership so often sound like pressure, instruction, and control? And behind that question stands a much larger story. Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traore, has become more than a country in political transition. It has become a symbol of a wider struggle across the Sahel, together with Mali and Niger, through the Alliance of Sahel States. Burkina Faso is challenging an old relationship in which African nations were expected to obey, depend, and accept decisions made far from their people. This is not just about one vote in Brussels. It is about sovereignty. It is about who gets to decide the future of African nations. It is about why the message of Ibrahim Traore and the AES has become powerful enough to force debate inside Europe itself. And as we walk through this story, stay with this channel, because the future of Africa is no longer being written quietly behind closed doors. The vote itself was never expected to be close. On June 18, 2026, the European Parliament adopted a resolution criticizing the situation in Burkina Faso. When the final numbers appeared on the screen, the outcome seemed overwhelming. 476 members voted in favor, 75 abstained. Only 11 voted against. From a legislative perspective, those 11 votes could not change the result. The resolution was adopted with an overwhelming majority, reflecting broad concern among many members of Parliament about civil liberties, governance, and the humanitarian situation in Burkina Faso. Yet, politics is not measured only by numbers. Sometimes the smallest minority raises the biggest questions. Why would anyone knowingly stand against nearly the entire chamber? Why would a member of the European Parliament choose to oppose a resolution that most political groups supported? The answer lies not in the vote itself, but in what that vote represented. For many supporters of the resolution, the issue centered on democracy, human rights, and the shrinking space for civil society in Burkina Faso. From their perspective, the European Union had both a moral responsibility and a political obligation to express concern over developments in the country. But for the 11 who voted against, the debate extended beyond the wording of the resolution. Among them, Belgian member of the European Parliament, Mark Botenga, argued that Europe should first examine its own relationship with Africa before presenting itself as the judge of African governments. Instead of asking only whether Burkina Faso had made mistakes, He challenged lawmakers to ask another question. Had Europe truly treated African nations as equal partners? That simple shift in perspective transformed what appeared to be an ordinary parliamentary vote into a much broader discussion about sovereignty, history, and the future relationship between Europe and Africa. While 476 votes confirmed the resolution, those 11 opposing voices ensured that another debate would continue long after the electronic voting board went dark. Mark Botenga was not an unknown politician suddenly seeking attention. Long before the debate over Burkina Faso, he had built a reputation inside the European Parliament as one of the lawmakers most willing to challenge Europe's foreign policy toward the global South, representing Belgium's Workers' Party and serving in the European Parliament's left group. Botenga has consistently argued that international partnerships should be based on equality rather than political pressure. His position on Burkina Faso, therefore, reflected a long-standing political philosophy rather than a temporary reaction. During the debate, Botenga did not argue that Burkina Faso should be free from criticism. Instead, he questioned what he viewed as a contradiction in Europe's approach to Africa. European leaders frequently describe Africa as a strategic partner, but according to Botenga, genuine partnership cannot exist if one side constantly dictates political choices while expecting the other to comply. Respect, he argued, must include the right of African nations to choose their own alliances, define their own development strategies, and shape their own future. He then broadened the discussion beyond Burkina Faso. He criticized the continued use of the CFA franc, the burden of external debt, and the unequal exploitation of Africa's natural resources. He also argued that Europe failed to demonstrate true solidarity during the global pandemic by refusing to share vaccine technology more widely. Perhaps his strongest point concerned the Sahel. Before European leaders lecture African governments about stability, he argued they should remember the consequences of the military intervention in Libya. In his view, that conflict helped fuel the instability that later spread across the region. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, Botenga redirected the debate. Instead of discussing only Burkina Faso's internal politics, he challenged Europe to examine its own role in Africa and asked whether genuine partnership is possible without fully respecting African sovereignty and the right of nations to determine their own future. As the debate unfolded inside the European Parliament, one name remained at the center of nearly every argument, whether spoken directly or implied: Captain Ibrahim Traore. Since taking power in 2022, Traore has pursued a vision centered on sovereignty. His government ended France's military presence in Burkina Faso, strengthened cooperation with Mali and Niger, and helped establish the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as the AES. Together, these countries declared that their security and political future should be determined primarily by Africans, rather than by outside powers. This shift transformed Burkina Faso from simply another country facing security challenges into a symbol of a broader movement across the Sahel. Supporters see Traore as a leader seeking greater independence, stronger regional cooperation, and national control over natural resources. Critics, however, question aspects of governance, democratic institutions, and civil liberties under military rule. These competing views explain why the discussion in Brussels became so significant. When Marc Botenga defended the principle of Burkina Faso's right to choose its own path, many observers connected that argument with the broader message promoted by Traore and the AES. The debate was no longer limited to one government or one resolution. It became a discussion about whether African nations should have the freedom to redefine their political partnerships without constant external pressure. Although only a small minority of European lawmakers openly shared this perspective, their intervention demonstrated that opinions inside Europe are not entirely uniform. The conversation surrounding Burkina Faso has evolved into a wider debate over sovereignty, regional integration, and the future relationship between Europe and Africa. In that sense, Ibrahim Traore and the AES have succeeded in pushing their central message beyond the borders of the Sahel and into one of Europe's most important political institutions. The European Parliament's resolution and Burkina Faso's response revealed two completely different interpretations of the same reality. For many European lawmakers, the resolution reflected concerns about civil liberties, governance, and the humanitarian situation inside Burkina Faso. They argued that the European Union has a responsibility to speak out whenever democratic institutions or fundamental freedoms appear to be under pressure. Burkina Faso's government saw the situation very differently. Shortly after the vote, the government summoned the European Union's ambassador to express its strong disagreement. Officials rejected the resolution as an unacceptable interference in the affairs of a sovereign nation. They argued that many of the claims ignored the country's security challenges and overlooked the progress they believed had been made in recovering territory from armed groups. The government also pointed to the 2011 military intervention in Libya, arguing that the collapse of Libya contributed significantly to the spread of terrorism and instability across the Sahel. From this perspective, European governments should recognize their own historical role before criticizing the choices made by countries now confronting those consequences. This is where Marc Botenga's intervention became especially significant. Rather than dismissing every concern raised by the European Parliament, he challenged the broader framework through which Europe approaches Africa. His argument suggested that discussions about democracy and human rights should also include respect for sovereignty, equal partnership, and the right of African nations to determine their own political future. The result is not a simple conflict between right and wrong. It is a clash between two competing visions. One emphasizes democratic standards and accountability. The other places sovereignty and self-determination at the center of national decision-making. Understanding both perspectives is essential to understanding why Burkina Faso has become one of the most debated countries in Europe today. The debate surrounding Burkina Faso extends far beyond one parliamentary resolution or one controversial vote. It reflects a larger transformation taking place across Africa and within Europe itself. For decades, discussions about Africa were often shaped almost exclusively by governments and institutions outside the continent. Today, countries such as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are increasingly insisting on defining their own priorities, security partnerships, and economic strategies. Whether people agree with every decision made by these governments or not, the demand for greater sovereignty has become impossible to ignore. The discussion inside the European Parliament illustrates this changing reality. Although only 11 members voted against the resolution, their arguments demonstrated that Europe is not entirely united on how it should engage with Africa. Some continue to emphasize governance and democratic standards, while others argue that lasting cooperation must begin with genuine respect for national sovereignty and equal partnership. For other African nations, this debate offers an important lesson: building stronger regional cooperation, investing in national institutions, managing natural resources responsibly, and speaking with a more independent voice can strengthen a country's position on the international stage. At the same time, constructive engagement with international partners remains essential, provided that cooperation is based on mutual respect rather than dependency. The conversation sparked by Burkina Faso is therefore larger than one country. It raises fundamental questions about how Africa and Europe will define their relationship in the decades ahead, and whether that relationship can evolve into one built on equality rather than inherited patterns of the past. The story of 11 votes against 476 is not really about numbers. It is about a growing debate over who has the right to shape Africa's future. Mark Botenga's decision did not alter the outcome of the European Parliament's resolution, yet it highlighted an important reality, even within Europe. There are different opinions about how relations with Africa should be built. Some believe accountability and democratic standards must remain the priority. Others argue that genuine cooperation cannot exist without fully respecting sovereignty and the right of nations to choose their own path. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States represents more than a new regional organization. It reflects a broader effort to redefine political, economic, and security cooperation on African terms. Whether this approach ultimately succeeds will depend on the choices made by their leaders and the support of their people. The broader lesson for Africa is equally significant. Strong institutions, regional cooperation, responsible management of natural resources, and confident diplomacy can strengthen national independence while preserving constructive international partnerships. Lasting development is most sustainable when it is driven by the priorities of the people themselves. As this debate continues, the ideas of Pan-Africanism remain central to discussions about the future of Burkina Faso, the African Union, and the vision promoted by Captain Ibrahim Traore. Whether one supports or questions Ibrahim Traore's policies, the conversation surrounding Africa New and the pursuit of Pan-African cooperation is unlikely to fade anytime soon. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue exploring the events, decisions, and ideas that are reshaping Africa's future.
What could push a former colony to shut the diplomatic door on the country that once ruled it for generations? That is the question now standing at the center of West Africa. Because Burkina Faso has taken a step that many people once thought was almost impossible. Just days after the European Parliament passed a resolution criticizing the political and civic situation inside Burkina Faso, the government led by Captain Ibrahim Traore announced that it was cutting diplomatic relations with France completely, not reducing them, not suspending them, not recalling an ambassador for a short protest, cutting them for Paris. This is not just another disagreement with an African government. It is a historic diplomatic blow, because Burkina Faso was once part of the French colonial system, and for decades after independence, France remained deeply connected to the country through politics, security, media, money, and influence. But Ouagadougou is now saying something very different. It is saying that sovereignty is not a decoration. It is not a word to be used in speeches and ignored in practice. It is the right of a nation to decide who enters its house, who speaks inside its house, and who must leave. If you follow the changing story of Africa, especially the Sahel, make sure you stay with this channel, because what is happening in Burkina Faso may not stop at Burkina Faso. The question tonight is simple. Was the European resolution the final drop that made the cup overflow? The answer begins with what happened in Strasbourg. Members of the European Parliament approved a resolution criticizing Burkina Faso over restrictions on civic freedoms, political rights, and the overall security situation. To many observers in Europe, the resolution was presented as a call for accountability. But in Ouagadougou, it was received very differently. Officials argued that the document relied on inaccurate information, ignored the country's security challenges, and crossed the line between concern and interference. Within days, Burkina Faso summoned European representatives and rejected what it described as a paternalistic attitude toward a sovereign African nation. Government officials insisted that decisions affecting the country's future should be made by Burkinabe institutions, not by lawmakers thousands of miles away. In their view, the issue was no longer simply about criticism. It had become a question of national dignity. And then came the announcement that stunned international observers. On June 26th, Burkina Faso declared that it was severing diplomatic relations with France with immediate effect. The decision marked the complete shutdown of official diplomatic ties between the two governments. Ambassadors would no longer represent their states through the usual diplomatic channels, and the relationship entered its most serious level of tension without crossing into armed conflict. This was not merely symbolic. In international diplomacy, cutting relations sends one of the strongest political messages a government can deliver during peacetime. It signals that trust has collapsed to the point where normal dialogue is no longer considered possible. While the people of both countries remain free to maintain cultural and personal connections, the formal relationship between their governments effectively comes to a halt. For many Africans, the announcement represented a declaration that Burkina Faso intended to define its future on its own terms, regardless of the political cost or the reactions from traditional Western partners. By the time Captain Ibrahim Traore came to power in September 2022, relations between Burkina Faso and France had already been under tremendous strain. Years of growing insecurity had fueled public frustration, and many citizens questioned whether decades of military cooperation with France had actually made their country safer. Instead of seeing stability, they saw expanding violence, repeated attacks, and entire communities forced to leave their homes. Traore entered office promising a different course. His government declared that Burkina Faso would reclaim full control over its security policies and reduce dependence on former colonial powers. Those promises were quickly followed by action. French special forces were asked to leave the country. Military agreements that had existed for years were terminated. Several French diplomats were later declared unwelcome, while French state-funded media outlets, including France 24 and Radio France Internationale, were suspended after authorities accused them of spreading information that threatened national security. Each decision represented another step away from the relationship that had shaped Burkina Faso's foreign policy for decades. None of them, however, completely closed the door. Diplomatic ties remained intact, leaving at least one formal channel for dialogue between Ouagadougou and Paris. The decision announced on June 26 changed that completely. Supporters of Captain Ibrahim Traore argue that this final step reflects a long-term strategy rather than an emotional reaction to one European resolution. In their view, the government has been systematically removing what it considers the remaining pillars of foreign influence, beginning with military cooperation, followed by media presence, privileges, and finally the official relationship itself. Whether one agrees with that strategy or not, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Each move built upon the previous one, creating a gradual but unmistakable transformation of Burkina Faso's foreign policy. The diplomatic rupture with France therefore appears less like an isolated event and more like the conclusion of a political roadmap that has been unfolding since 2022. Captain Ibrahim Traore has become one of the most closely watched political figures in Africa, not simply because of his age or military background, but because of the message he has consistently delivered since taking office. At the center of that message is one idea: Burkina Faso must regain full control over its own future, even if that means confronting long-established international partners. To many of his supporters, Traore represents a new generation of African leadership that places sovereignty above foreign approval. His speeches often emphasize that security decisions, economic policies, and diplomatic partnerships should be determined by the people of Burkina Faso rather than by outside governments. This position has earned him growing admiration among many Pan-African movements that believe African nations should rely more on regional cooperation and less on former colonial powers. Western governments, however, view the situation very differently. Critics have expressed concern over restrictions affecting political opposition, independent media, and civil society organizations. Human rights groups have also raised questions about freedom of expression and the conduct of security operations during the fight against armed extremist groups. From this perspective, Burkina Faso's recent decisions risk increasing diplomatic isolation while reducing opportunities for international cooperation. Supporters of Traore offer a different argument. They contend that extraordinary security challenges require difficult decisions, and that every sovereign nation has the right to determine how it protects its citizens. They also argue that many Western governments criticize African leaders while overlooking their own strategic interests in the region. Whether one accepts this argument or not, it reflects a growing sentiment among many Africans who believe that relationships with foreign powers should be based on equality rather than dependency. This debate extends far beyond Burkina Faso. It raises larger questions about how African nations balance national sovereignty with international partnerships, security with democratic governance, and independence with economic cooperation. Captain Ibrahim Traore has become one of the most visible symbols of that debate, making every decision taken by his government closely watched both across Africa and around the world. Burkina Faso's decision may have been announced by one government, but its consequences extend far beyond one country. It also raises an important question about the future of the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as the AES, since its creation. The partnership between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has gradually evolved from a military security agreement into a broader political and diplomatic project aimed at strengthening regional sovereignty. The three governments have repeatedly demonstrated that they prefer to move together when responding to major regional challenges. They withdrew from the Economic Community of West African States after accusing the organization of serving external political interests. They expanded security cooperation among themselves and began exploring new economic and diplomatic partnerships outside the traditional Western sphere. Seen from this perspective, Burkina Faso's latest decision could become another chapter in a much larger regional transformation. That possibility has attracted significant international attention. Some analysts believe Mali and Niger may eventually adopt similar diplomatic measures toward France, if they conclude that doing so supports their long-term strategic goals. Others argue that each country faces different economic realities and security pressures, making identical decisions far from guaranteed. At this stage, no official announcement from either government suggests that such a move is imminent. Regardless of what happens next, one reality is already becoming clear. France's influence in the Sahel has changed dramatically over the past several years. Military withdrawals, declining political partnerships, and the emergence of new regional alliances have reshaped relationships that once appeared firmly established. Whether this transition ultimately produces greater stability remains uncertain, but it unquestionably marks the beginning of a new geopolitical chapter. For observers across Africa, the story is no longer simply about Burkina Faso or France. It is about whether African nations can redefine their partnerships while protecting both their sovereignty and their long-term development. The answer will likely shape not only the future of the Sahel, but also the broader direction of regional cooperation across the continent. The developments surrounding Burkina Faso also offer important lessons for the rest of Africa. Whether one agrees with every decision made by its government or not, the events of recent years have reopened a continent-wide conversation about sovereignty, partnerships, and national development. The first lesson is that political independence and strategic independence are not always the same. A country may have gained independence decades ago, yet still depend heavily on foreign governments for security, economic assistance, or major political decisions. Burkina Faso's leadership has argued that true sovereignty requires the ability to make difficult national decisions without external pressure. That idea continues to resonate with many Africans, who believe their countries should have greater control over their own futures. The second lesson is the importance of diversifying international partnerships. Relying too heavily on a single foreign power can create long-term vulnerabilities. Many African governments are now expanding cooperation with multiple partners across different regions, seeking to reduce dependence while increasing their diplomatic flexibility. This approach does not necessarily mean rejecting one partner in favor of another. Rather, it reflects an effort to create more balanced relationships based on mutual interests. Choice? The third lesson concerns dialogue itself. While strong political statements can demonstrate determination, lasting stability usually requires open channels of communication. Diplomatic disagreements may be unavoidable, but history often shows that negotiations remain one of the most effective tools for reducing misunderstandings and preventing unnecessary escalation. Finally, Burkina Faso's experience reminds every African nation that symbolic decisions must ultimately produce practical results. Citizens will judge success not only by powerful speeches or historic announcements, but by improvements in security, economic opportunity, education, healthcare, and daily life. In the end, sovereignty achieves its greatest meaning when it creates measurable benefits for ordinary people. That will remain the true test not only for Burkina Faso, but for every nation seeking a more independent path in the years ahead. History often remembers moments when nations decide that the old way of doing things can no longer continue. Whether Burkina Faso's decision proves to be a turning point or simply another chapter in a long diplomatic dispute will only become clear with time. What is certain is that the relationship between Ouagadougou and Paris has entered completely new territory. The coming months will be closely watched across Africa and beyond. Will Mali and Niger eventually follow the same diplomatic path? Will France seek to rebuild trust through dialogue? Or will both sides continue moving further apart? Most importantly, will this new direction bring greater security, stronger economic development, and lasting stability for the people of Burkina Faso? Those are the questions that matter far more than political headlines alone. For many supporters of Pan-African ideas, this moment represents another step toward an Africa that makes its own strategic decisions without relying on former colonial powers. Others remain cautious, arguing that true independence must also be matched by economic growth, institutional strength, and opportunities that improve the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Time will determine which vision proves closer to reality. One thing is beyond dispute. Burkina Faso has placed itself at the center of one of Africa's most significant geopolitical debates. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore, the country has chosen a path that continues to generate discussion throughout the African Union and across the wider international community. Whether viewed through the lens of Pan-Africanism, diplomacy, or Africa New, the decisions made by Ibrahim Traore have already become part of a much larger conversation about the continent's future. Now, I would like to hear your opinion. Do you believe Burkina Faso has opened the door to a new chapter for the entire Sahel? Or do you think this diplomatic rupture will remain an isolated case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy thoughtful discussions about Africa, Pan-African affairs, and the major stories shaping our world today, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next analysis. Have you noticed something unusual happening across the Sahel in recent weeks? Within a remarkably short period of time, senior officials and high-level delegations from Benin, Mauritania, and Côte d'Ivoire have all sought closer contact with the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES. For many observers, this sudden wave of diplomatic outreach has raised an important question. Why now? What makes these developments even more intriguing is that these countries were not always aligned with the political direction taken by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger during the early stages of their transitions. Yet today, messages of cooperation, dialogue, and renewed engagement seem to be coming from several directions at once. Does this signal a genuine desire for regional reconciliation, or could it represent a strategic adjustment after previous methods of pressure failed to produce the expected results? While no one can claim to know every discussion taking place behind closed doors, one thing is certain. The diplomatic landscape around AES is changing. To understand what may be happening, we first need to examine a larger reality. The AES that many critics once predicted would struggle to survive is no longer viewed in the same way. Over the past few years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have strengthened cooperation in security, political coordination, and regional planning. Instead of disappearing from the regional scene, the alliance has become one of the most closely watched developments in West Africa. And if you care about the future of the Sahel and the rise of a more self-reliant Africa, be sure to subscribe to the channel because the story we are about to explore may reveal much more than a series of diplomatic visits. The recent diplomatic activity surrounding the Alliance of Sahel States has not gone unnoticed. One event involved the new leadership of Benin seeking greater engagement with AES members. Discussions reportedly included the possibility of reopening important border connections and restoring stronger economic exchanges. Such proposals naturally attract attention because regional trade remains vital for both neighboring countries and local populations that depend on cross-border commerce. Another development came from Mauritania. Senior officials emphasized cooperation on security matters, regional stability, and coordination against common threats. Given the security challenges that continue to affect parts of the Sahel, such discussions can be viewed as practical and necessary. However, many citizens are still asking why these initiatives appear to be arriving almost simultaneously. Then there is Côte d'Ivoire. Statements supporting closer communication and cooperation with AES have added another layer to the conversation. For many observers, the question is not whether dialogue should exist. Most people recognize that neighboring states must communicate. The real question is why several governments that once appeared distant from the political direction of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are now expressing interest in renewed engagement. Supporters of AES often point to this timing as significant. They argue that if these countries are reaching out today, it may be because the alliance has demonstrated greater resilience than many expected. Critics once predicted isolation, economic collapse, or political fragmentation. Yet AES continues to function, coordinate policies, and maintain its presence on the regional stage. Of course, timing alone does not prove any hidden agenda. International relations are often shaped by changing realities. Governments adjust policies when circumstances evolve. Nevertheless, the simultaneous appearance of diplomatic initiatives from multiple directions has created a sense of curiosity across the Sahel, encouraging many people to look beyond individual visits and consider the broader regional picture. As people search for answers, another important question emerges. Why has AES become so difficult to ignore? The answer begins with geography, resources, and influence. The Sahel occupies a strategic position connecting several regions of Africa. Trade routes, migration flows, security concerns, and economic interests often intersect across this vast area. What happens in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger rarely stays within their borders. The effects are felt across neighboring states as well. Beyond geography, the region possesses significant natural resources. Gold, uranium, and other valuable minerals have long attracted international attention. For decades, control over these resources has been closely linked to discussions about sovereignty, development, and foreign influence. As AES leaders increasingly emphasize national control over strategic assets, regional governments are paying close attention to the consequences. At the same time, AES has evolved into something larger than a security partnership. It is increasingly viewed as a political project with its own identity and vision. whether one agrees with every decision made by its leaders or not. The alliance has become a factor that regional governments must consider when planning their own strategies. This reality helps explain why diplomatic language may be changing. Governments generally prefer engagement with actors that possess influence, legitimacy among their populations, or strategic importance. The stronger AES appears, the greater the incentive for neighboring countries to maintain communication. For ordinary citizens across the Sahel, this creates an interesting dilemma. On one hand, renewed dialogue can reduce tensions and create opportunities for trade and cooperation. On the other hand, many people remain cautious because they remember previous disagreements and conflicting political positions. That is why the debate continues. Are these diplomatic initiatives signs of a new chapter in regional relations, or are they simply acknowledgments that AES has become a reality that can no longer be ignored? The growing attention directed toward AES cannot be separated from the image of one particular leader, Ibrahim Traore. Whether admired or criticized, he has become one of the most recognizable political figures in contemporary Africa. His influence now extends far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. For many supporters, Traore represents a generation of African leaders determined to place sovereignty at the center of national decision-making. His speeches frequently emphasize self-reliance, control over national resources, and the right of African nations to choose their own partnerships without external pressure. These themes resonate strongly with many citizens across the continent, particularly among younger Africans seeking new models of leadership. As a result, developments involving Burkina Faso often attract attention far beyond what would normally be expected for a country of its size. Discussions about AES are increasingly linked to broader conversations about African independence, economic control, and regional cooperation. In that sense, the alliance is no longer viewed solely as a security arrangement. It is also seen by many as a symbol of political transformation. This helps explain why every diplomatic approach toward AES is closely scrutinized. When foreign officials visit Burkina Faso or seek closer engagement with the alliance, many observers ask whether they are simply engaging with a regional organization or responding to a growing political movement that has captured public attention across Africa. At the same time, it is important to recognize that influence brings responsibility. The more visible a leader becomes, the more carefully every decision is examined. Supporters expect consistency. Critics search for weaknesses. Partners evaluate opportunities. Rivals monitor developments. For this reason, recent diplomatic outreach toward AES is being interpreted through multiple lenses. Some see opportunities for constructive cooperation. Others see attempts to shape the future direction of the alliance. What is undeniable is that the rise of Ibrahim Traore has changed the way many people interpret political events throughout the Sahel. The growing influence of Ibrahim Traore also explains why discussions about AES often extend beyond immediate security concerns. Across many parts of Africa, debates surrounding the alliance have become connected to larger questions about sovereignty, development, and the future direction of the continent. Supporters frequently argue that one of the most important lessons from African history is that nations must remain vigilant when navigating international relationships. They point out that diplomacy can bring investment, trade, and stability. But it can also create new forms of dependence if leaders fail to protect national interests. From this perspective, caution is not a sign of hostility. It is a sign of political maturity. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to assume that every diplomatic initiative is driven by hidden motives. Countries often change policies because realities change. Economic interests evolve. Security concerns shift. Regional priorities adapt to new circumstances. This is a normal feature of international relations. That is why many observers believe the most important question is not whether AES should engage with neighboring countries. The more important question is how that engagement should occur. Can cooperation be expanded while maintaining strategic independence? Can new partnerships be developed without compromising core principles? These are the issues that will shape the next chapter of the alliance. For Ibrahim Traore and other AES leaders, the challenge is significant. They must balance openness with caution, opportunity with vigilance, and diplomacy with sovereignty. The choices made today could influence the political landscape of the Sahel for many years to come. As a result, the recent visits from Benin, Mauritania, and Côte d'Ivoire are being watched carefully by citizens throughout the region. Many people are less interested in official statements and more interested in the long-term consequences that may emerge from these renewed relationships. History offers an important lesson for every nation that seeks to protect its sovereignty. The greatest challenges do not always arrive through open confrontation. Sometimes they emerge through complex negotiations, economic incentives, political influence, or shifting regional dynamics. This is why many citizens across the Sahel believe that vigilance remains essential, regardless of who is extending a hand of friendship. However, vigilance should never be confused with isolation. No country can prosper by standing completely alone. Trade, diplomacy, security cooperation, and regional partnerships are all necessary components of long-term stability. The challenge is finding the right balance between engagement and independence. In the case of AES, several possible scenarios could explain the recent diplomatic activity. One possibility is that neighboring countries genuinely want to reduce tensions and improve cooperation after years of disagreement. Another possibility is that changing economic realities are encouraging governments to rebuild relationships that have become strategically important. A third possibility is that AES has gained enough regional influence that other states now view engagement as a practical necessity. There is also a perspective shared by some observers who believe that diplomacy can sometimes serve as a tool for influence. While there is no clear evidence proving such intentions in the current situation, this possibility explains why many citizens continue to ask questions and examine developments carefully. Ultimately, the most effective strategy for AES may not be to reject diplomatic outreach or to embrace it unconditionally. Instead, success may depend on maintaining clear principles, protecting national interests, and ensuring that every partnership delivers tangible benefits to the people. The future of the Sahel will likely be shaped not only by military strength or political speeches, but also by the wisdom with which leaders manage opportunities, risks, and relationships in an increasingly complex regional environment. As we examine all these developments together, one conclusion becomes clear. The question is not simply whether Benin, Mauritania, and Côte d'Ivoire are reaching out to AES. The deeper question is why these diplomatic initiatives are emerging at this particular moment in history. Perhaps the answer lies in the growing importance of the Alliance of Sahel States itself. What was once viewed by some observers as a temporary political arrangement has evolved into a regional actor that commands attention. Whether through security cooperation, political coordination, or discussions about economic sovereignty, AES has established a presence that neighboring countries can no longer ignore. At the same time, caution remains a valuable principle. There is currently no evidence proving that every diplomatic approach conceals a negative agenda. Responsible analysis requires distinguishing facts from speculation. Yet, history also teaches that nations must remain alert whenever major strategic interests are involved. Cooperation and vigilance are not opposites. In many cases, they must exist side by side. This is where the broader vision of a Pan-African future becomes relevant. Across Burkina Faso, and beyond. Many citizens believe that the next chapter of Africa should be written by Africans themselves. Ideas associated with Pan-Africanism continue to inspire discussions about sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination. Leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traore and other figures within AES have become symbols of that debate, whether one agrees with every policy or not. The challenge ahead will be determining how AES engages with new opportunities while preserving its core principles. The future of the African Union, the aspirations of an Africa new generation, and the hopes of millions who support greater sovereignty may all be influenced by decisions made in the coming years. One thing is certain: the story is far from over. Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso, and the broader Pan-African movement will remain at the center of conversations shaping the future of the Sahel. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.